September 17th, 1944, 0642 hours, the outskirts of a village called Merbrugge in Belgium, and the dawn is not breaking so much as bleeding through a sky the color of old bruises, purple and grey, and shot through with the orange glow of fires that have been burning for 3 days now, the air thick with the smell of cordite and something else, something sweeter and more terrible, that Private First Class Harold Edward Murray has learned to recognize as the smell of human beings decomposing in the September heat. He is 26 years old, born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and he is crouched in a shell crater that was made sometime in the night by a German 105mm howitzer round, the earth around him still warm from the explosion, and his hands, the hands that his mother always said were made for healing, are covered in blood that is not his own, blood that has dried to a brown crust under his fingernails and in the creases of his palms, and which he has stopped trying to wash off, because there is always another wounded man screaming for help, always another body to drag from the killing ground, and the water in his canteen is too precious to waste on something as pointless as cleanliness. The medical kit strapped across his chest weighs 11 pounds when full, but it feels like it weighs 100 now, the weight of every man he has treated and every man he has failed to save pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden that grows heavier with each passing hour, and he can feel his knees trembling, not from fear exactly, though fear is certainly present, but from the specific exhaustion that comes from running on adrenaline for 72 hours straight, the body's reserves depleted to the point where even breathing feels like an act of will. Up to this moment, in the 14 months since he landed in Sicily with the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, Harold Murray has treated 437 wounded men, a number he knows precisely because he has kept count, has recorded each name in a small notebook that he carries in his breast pocket next to the photograph of his wife Eleanor, a habit that began as a way to honor the men he helped and has become something else, something closer to an obsession, a compulsive need to quantify the unquantifiable, to impose order on chaos through the simple act of writing names in columns. Of those 437, 63 died, despite his efforts, died while he was applying pressure to wounds that would not stop bleeding, died while he was searching for morphine syrettes in a kit that was never full enough, died while he was telling them that they would be fine, that help was coming, that they just needed to hold on a little longer. Lies that came easily now because the alternative was to tell a dying man the truth. And what possible good could the truth do for someone whose intestines were spilling out onto the Belgian mud? But now something different, something that sits in his stomach like a stone and makes the familiar terror of combat seem almost manageable by comparison. In exactly 4 hours and 18 minutes, as the Allied advance pushes toward the Leopold Canal and the German defenders make their desperate stand, Harold Murray is going to perform a feat that will not be officially recorded, will not earn him any medal or commendation, will not be spoken of by the officers who witness it, but which will haunt him for the remaining 61 years of his life and will only come to light in 2005, when his granddaughter discovers a reel-to-reel tape in a box of his belongings and hears, for the first time, the voice of a man she thought she knew, describing events that no one in the family ever suspected he had experienced. The Germans dug in along the canal do not know that Harold Murray exists, do not know that among the Canadian forces preparing to assault their positions, there is a medic who will, over the course of a single day, rescue 75 wounded men from the killing ground under continuous fire, moving through a storm of bullets and shrapnel, with a determination that defies explanation, that defies the survival instincts that should have kept him cowering in a hole, that defies everything except the strange, terrible calculus of a man who has decided that saving others is the only way to save himself. They expect the Canadians to advance in predictable waves, to be cut down by the interlocking fields of fire that have been prepared over weeks of defensive construction, to die in the same mathematical progression that has defined infantry warfare since the invention of the machine gun. And they are not wrong about any of this. The Canadians will advance and they will be cut down, and the mathematics of death will function exactly as predicted, but what the Germans cannot predict, what no one can predict, is the presence of a single medic who will turn the killing ground into something else, a space where wounded men have a chance, however small, of survival, and whose actions will save lives that should by all rights have been lost. The advantage the Canadians possessed was not numerical, not in this sector, where they were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 by defenders who had the benefit of prepared positions and superior knowledge of the terrain, and it was not technological, not when both sides were using weapons that had been refined through 5 years of continuous warfare to a state of lethal efficiency, and it was not even tactical, not when the assault plan called for a frontal attack across open ground against an entrenched enemy, the kind of attack that military academies use as examples of what not to do. They had something else, something that could not be quantified or planned for, something that emerged from the chaos of battle like a force of nature. They had Harold Murray, a man who had already died inside, who had watched so many men die that the concept of his own death had lost its power to terrify him, who moved through the firefight with the calm deliberation of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear, and whose medical kit, restocked 4 times over the course of the day from the bodies of fallen comrades, became the thin membrane between life and death for 75 men who would otherwise have bled out in the Belgian mud. To understand why what happened at Moorbrugge represented such a profound psychological rupture for Harold Murray, a rupture that would not begin to heal until decades after his death, when his family finally understood what he had carried, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the war, back to a childhood in Saskatoon where a boy with gentle hands learned that healing was a calling and killing was a sin, and where neither lesson prepared him for the reality of being a combat medic. In the most violent conflict in human history, the German defensive doctrine along the Leopold Canal was a refinement of principles that had been developed through years of fighting on the Eastern Front, a doctrine called elastic defense, or elastische Verteidigung, which emphasized the use of strong points and mobile reserves rather than continuous trench lines, allowing defenders to absorb the initial shock of an attack and then counterattack with concentrated force against an enemy that had become disorganized in the assault. The architect of this doctrine, at least in its application to the Western Front, was Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known to his troops as the Führer's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing sectors, and who had implemented a defensive system along the canal that was designed to maximize Canadian casualties while minimizing German exposure, a system of interconnected bunkers and trenches that allowed defenders to withdraw from positions under heavy bombardment and then reoccupy them once the artillery lifted, presenting the advancing infantry with resistance that seemed to regenerate like a hydra's head. The fundamental assumptions of this doctrine were 4. First, that artillery preparation, no matter how intense, could not destroy all defensive positions, and that survivors would be sufficient to impose unacceptable casualties on attacking infantry. Second, that attacking troops would be forced to cross open ground that had been pre-registered for mortar and machine gun fire, creating kill zones from which escape was nearly impossible. Third, that the psychological strain of advancing under fire would cause attacking units to bunch up, seek cover and lose momentum, allowing defenders to concentrate fire on static targets. And fourth, that medical evacuation would be impossible in the kill zone, meaning that wounded attackers would either die where they fell or consume additional resources as their comrades tried to rescue them, further degrading the combat effectiveness of the attacking force. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were based on hard experience from Kursk and Kharkov and a dozen other battles where the German army had learned to trade space for time and casualties for survival, and in most circumstances they would have been validated once again at Moorbrugge, except that the fourth assumption, the assumption about medical evacuation, was about to be proven catastrophically wrong by a single man with a red cross on his helmet and a determination that bordered on insanity. The German commanders trusted in the mathematics of their defensive system with a confidence that was almost religious in its intensity, trusting numbers that had been proven in blood. A properly sighted MG-42 machine gun could cover a front of 400 meters with interlocking fire, delivering 1,200 rounds per minute in bursts that made the air itself seem to vibrate. A single 81mm mortar could drop 20 rounds per minute into a pre-registered kill zone, each round producing a lethal radius of 20 meters. A defensive position constructed according to Wehrmacht engineering standards could survive direct hits from anything smaller than a 155mm howitzer and continue to function at 60% effectiveness even after sustaining significant damage. They had the reports from previous engagements, the after-action assessments that documented Canadian attacks broken against similar defenses at Ortona and the Hitler Line, and a dozen nameless crossroads and villages, and they had seen with their own eyes how attacking infantry wilted under sustained fire, how the bravest soldiers eventually sought cover, how the momentum of an assault could be bled away by the simple expedient of making the open ground too dangerous to cross. Oberst Gerhard Wilke, the commander of the defensive sector that included Moerbrugge, had stated in a briefing to his officers just 2 days before the assault that the Canadians would lose at least 300 men attempting to cross the kill zone, and that reinforcements from the reserve battalion would not be needed because the forward positions were more than sufficient to break any attack, a prediction that was accurate in its assessment of Canadian casualties, but fatally wrong in its assumption that those casualties would remain where they fell. This was not ignorance in the conventional sense. German intelligence along the canal was thorough and professional, fed by reconnaissance patrols that probed the Canadian lines nightly and by observation posts that tracked every movement in the forward areas. They knew the approximate strength of the Canadian forces preparing to attack, knew the composition of the units involved, knew the likely timing of the assault based on the pattern of artillery registration fire that had been conducted over the previous 48 hours. What they failed to grasp, what they couldn't internalize until they watched it happen through their binoculars and rifle scopes, was that the Canadians had a medic who would refuse to accept the mathematics, who would enter the kill zone not once, but dozens of times, who would drag wounded men to safety through fire that should have killed him 10 times over, and whose survival, inexplicable by any rational calculation, would become the pivot point around which the entire battle turned. The irony of German preparation at Moerbrugge was crystallized in the ammunition allocation. Thousands of rounds had been stockpiled for the MG-42 positions, the gunners trained to deliver sustained fire for periods of up to 30 minutes without pause, based on the assumption that the attack would be a single wave that would either succeed or fail within that time frame. But Harold Murray's interventions stretched the battle across 8 hours, as wounded men who should have been left to die were instead evacuated and replaced by fresh troops, the assault regenerating itself in ways that the defensive doctrine had not anticipated, the ammunition stocks depleting faster than predicted, because there were always more targets, always more Canadians emerging from the smoke and the chaos to continue the attack that should have ended in the first hour. The defenders found themselves fighting not a single battle, but a series of battles, each one smaller than the last as their own casualties mounted and their ammunition dwindled. And by the end of the day, the positions that were supposed to be impregnable had been overrun, not by superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but by the stubborn refusal of a single medic to let the wounded die, a refusal that kept the attack alive long enough to exhaust the defense. But before the bullets and the blood, there was the man, and Harold Edward Murray was not born to be a hero, was not born with any particular courage or strength that set him apart from his peers, was born instead with a sensitivity that his father considered a weakness and his mother considered a gift, a boy who cried when animals were hurt and who spent hours in the garden watching insects and birds with a fascination that his siblings found incomprehensible. Born on April 23, 1918, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, the fourth of 6 children to Robert Murray, a grain elevator operator who worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and came home smelling of wheat dust and exhaustion, and Agnes Murray née Stewart, a woman of fierce Presbyterian faith who had lost 2 brothers in the Great War and who saw in her youngest son's gentleness a sign that perhaps God had finally decided to spare her family from the violence that had claimed so many of their generation. Harold's childhood was defined by the rhythms of the prairie, the endless wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, the brutal winters that killed livestock and froze pipes and made every day a struggle for survival, the brief explosive summers when the world came alive and the sky seemed to stretch forever, a canvas of blue that made him feel simultaneously insignificant and connected to something vast and eternal. He was not a strong child, not in the physical sense that his father valued, and he endured the mockery of his older brothers with a stoic acceptance that was mistaken for weakness but was actually something else, a patience that came from understanding that strength took many forms and that the form his father recognized was not the only one that mattered. His mother recognized his gifts before anyone else, saw how he would spend hours tending to injured birds that had struck the windows of their farmhouse, how he would carefully splint broken wings with twigs and strips of cloth, how he would keep vigil over his patients with a dedication that bordered on obsession, and she told him, when he was 12 years old and weeping over a sparrow that had died despite his efforts, that God had given him healing hands and that someday those hands would save lives. He believed her, believed with the simple faith of a child that his purpose in the world was to heal, and this belief shaped every decision he made from that moment forward, guiding him toward a career in medicine that his family could not afford, but that he pursued anyway, working nights at the grain elevator to pay for correspondence courses in anatomy and first aid, studying by kerosene lamp until his eyes burned and his head ached, driven by a vision of himself as a doctor, a healer, a man, who would repay his mother's faith by spending his life saving others. The reality, as it so often does, intervened before the dream could be realized. The Depression hit Saskatchewan harder than almost anywhere else in Canada. The combination of drought and falling wheat prices, reducing families that had been comfortable to desperate poverty, and Harold watched his father's spirit break as the elevator cut hours and then cut workers and then closed entirely, leaving Robert Murray with nothing but his pride and his bitterness and his conviction that the world was fundamentally unfair to men who worked hard and played by the rules. Harold dropped out of school at 16 to help support the family, taking whatever work he could find, farmhand and stockboy and delivery driver, jobs that paid pennies and demanded hours that left no time for studying, and he watched his dream of medical school recede into the distance like the horizon he had gazed at as a child, always visible but never reachable. He met Eleanor Thompson at a church social in 1938, a schoolteacher, 3 years his junior, with brown hair and a laugh that made him feel for the first time in years that the future might hold something other than grinding poverty and disappointment, and they were married 6 months later in a ceremony attended by 37 people in the same Presbyterian church where Harold had been baptized. Eleanor understood his dream, encouraged him to continue his studies even as they struggled to make ends meet on her teacher's salary and his irregular income, and she was the one who suggested, when war broke out in September 39, that the army might be his path to medicine, that the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps would train him as a medic, and that after the war, with the skills he learned and the money he saved, he might finally be able to attend medical school and become the doctor he had always wanted to be. It was Eleanor who walked him to the recruiting office in Saskatoon on October 15, 1940, Eleanor who held his hand while he signed the papers, Eleanor who told him that she would wait for however long it took and that she believed in him, believed that he would come home safe and that the war would be the beginning of something good rather than the end of everything they had built together. That conversation, the last real conversation they had before he shipped out, would replay in Harold's mind thousands of times over the next 4 years, the memory of her face and her words becoming a talisman that he clutched in the darkest moments, a reminder that somewhere in the world there was a woman who loved him and a future that was worth surviving for, even when survival seemed impossible and the future seemed like a cruel joke. His basic training at Camp Shiloh was 16 weeks of physical conditioning and weapons familiarization that stripped away the gentle boy his mother had raised and began the construction of something harder, someone who could function in the chaos of combat without freezing or breaking. But it was the specialized medical training at the #1 Canadian General Hospital in Bramshott, England, that truly transformed him. 8 months of intensive instruction in trauma surgery and battlefield triage and the brutal mathematics of mass casualty events that taught him skills his correspondence courses had never imagined and confronted him with realities his prairie childhood had not prepared him for. His instructor, a British Army surgeon named Major Alistair Blackwood, who had served in the Great War and who carried shrapnel in his left leg that made him limp when the weather was cold, told the class on their first day that their job was not to save everyone, that saving everyone was impossible, that their job was to save the ones who could be saved and to make the ones who could not be saved comfortable while they died, and that the difference between a good medic and a dead medic was the ability to make that distinction quickly and without sentiment. Harold struggled with this lesson, struggled with the cold calculus that treated human beings as problems to be solved rather than souls to be cherished, and he wrote to Eleanor about it in letters that he carefully censored before sending, letters that spoke of his confusion and his doubt without revealing the specific images that haunted his sleep, the training films that showed wounds he had never imagined, the practice exercises that used pig carcasses to simulate the damage that artillery could do to human flesh, the slow erosion of his belief that healing was always possible if you just tried hard enough. His first experience under fire was in Sicily, July 20th, 1943, a skirmish on the road to Enna that lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but which compressed a lifetime of education into a span of time that seemed both endless and instantaneous. And he remembered crouching behind a low stone wall while bullets cracked overhead, remembered the scream of a corporal named Jenkins who had been hit in the stomach, remembered running toward the sound without consciously deciding to move, his body acting on training while his mind recoiled in terror. Jenkins died in his arms, died while Harold was trying to stop the bleeding with pressure and prayers, died while looking into Harold's eyes with an expression of confusion that Harold would see in his dreams for the rest of his life. And when it was over, when the firing stopped and the other medics came to help, Harold walked behind a building and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach, and then he sat on the ground and wept while his hands, covered in Jenkins' blood, shook so badly that he could not light the cigarette that another soldier offered him. He did not quit, did not request a transfer, did not do any of the things that his terror screamed at him to do, because somewhere in the depths of his mind was his mother's voice telling him that God had given him healing hands, and because somewhere in his breast pocket was Eleanor's photograph, and because the alternative to continuing was to admit that everything he had believed about himself was a lie. He learned over the months that followed to suppress the terror, to channel it into action, to use the adrenaline that flooded his system as fuel for the impossible tasks that combat demanded, and he progressed from incompetent and terrified to adequate and functioning to proficient and valuable, a medic whose steadiness under fire earned him the respect of soldiers who had initially dismissed him as too soft for the work. The moral weight of his role crystallized during the Italian campaign, in a moment that would stay with him longer than any other, a moment that he never spoke of to anyone until the recording that would be discovered 60 years later captured his voice, describing it in fragments and whispers. It was October of 1943, somewhere in the mountains south of Cassino, and his unit had taken a German position after heavy fighting, and among the enemy dead was a medic, a young man perhaps 20 years old, with red crosses on his helmet and his armband just like Harold's, and Harold stood over the body and felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the man at his feet had been doing the same job he was doing, had been trying to save lives just as he was trying to save lives, and that the only difference between them was the accident of birth that had put one in a Canadian uniform and one in a German uniform. He knelt beside the dead medic and searched his pockets, not for intelligence but out of a need to know who this person had been, and he found a photograph of a young woman holding an infant, a photograph that could have been Eleanor holding the child they had talked about having after the war, and Harold sat in the mud beside his dead counterpart and wept again, wept for the enemy and wept for himself, and wept for the obscenity of a world where men whose only purpose was to heal were forced to watch each other die. And he never told anyone what he had found, kept the photograph in his kit for the rest of the war, a secret talisman that reminded him of the humanity that existed on both sides of the line and the terrible waste of it all. The technique that would define Harold's actions at Moorbrugge was officially known as forward aid post extension, but the men who practiced it called it running the gauntlet, a method of casualty evacuation that violated every principle of self-preservation and which was only employed when the alternative was to let wounded men die within sight of safety. For the medical corps planners who designed the system, it was a theoretical framework for extreme situations. For Harold Murray, it would become a way of life and a path toward a trauma so profound that he would spend 60 years refusing to acknowledge it existed. The medical kit that Harold Murray carried into battle was officially designated the Medical Orderly's Haversack Mark III, a canvas bag measuring 14 inches by 10 inches by 6 inches that contained, when fully stocked, the difference between life and death for dozens of men, a portable emergency room compressed into a space smaller than a shoebox and weighing 11 pounds that felt like 100 after 8 hours of continuous movement through terrain that the human body was never designed to traverse. The contents were standardized across the Canadian Army Medical Corps, each item selected through years of trial and error and the accumulated wisdom of medics who had learned through experience what worked and what didn't, what saved lives and what was merely comforting, what was worth the wait and what could be left behind when every ounce mattered, and exhaustion made the difference between reaching a wounded man in time and arriving 30 seconds too late to make a difference. The primary components were 24 first field dressings, each one a sterile pad of absorbent cotton wrapped in gauze, and sealed in waterproof packaging, designed to be applied quickly to wounds that ranged from minor lacerations to catastrophic trauma, the universal tool that every medic reached for first because stopping the bleeding was always the priority, always the first step in the chain of survival that might or might not lead to the operating table and the surgeon's skilled hands. 4 triangular bandages provided additional options for immobilization and pressure, capable of being fashioned into slings or tourniquets or head wraps, depending on the location and severity of the injury, their versatility making them invaluable in situations where the wound didn't match anything the training manuals had anticipated. 6 morphine syrettes, each containing a half-grain dose of morphine tartrate in a small collapsible tube with an attached hypodermic needle, represented the medic's primary tool for pain management, the merciful intervention that could transform a screaming, thrashing casualty into a calm patient capable of being transported. Though the supply was never adequate for the demand, and Harold had learned to make agonizing decisions about who received the precious drug and who would have to endure their pain without relief. 2 bottles of sulfanilamide powder, the miracle drug that had revolutionized wound care by preventing the infections that had killed more soldiers in previous wars than the wounds themselves, were dusted liberally into every open injury regardless of severity, the white powder becoming as familiar a sight on the battlefield as blood itself. A tourniquet, scissors, safety pins, a roll of adhesive tape, and a small bottle of iodine completed the standard loadout, along with 2 canteens of water that were used as much for cleaning wounds as for drinking, the precious liquid rationed carefully because resupply in combat was never guaranteed, and dehydration killed almost as efficiently as bullets. For the engineers who designed this kit, it was a marvel of logistical efficiency, a carefully calibrated balance between capability and portability that reflected the best thinking of military medicine in the 1940s. For Harold Murray, crouched in his shell crater watching the sky lighten over Moorbrugge, it was simultaneously his most valuable possession and a cruel reminder of how inadequate any preparation was against the scale of violence that was about to unfold. He had restocked the kit 3 times in the past 72 hours, scavenging supplies from dead medics and abandoned aid posts and the carefully hoarded reserves of the battalion medical officer, and he knew that by the end of the day, if he survived that long, he would have to restock again, the consumption of medical supplies in active combat far exceeding anything the planners had anticipated, the neat columns of numbers in the logistics tables bearing no relationship to the reality of wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding and men who wouldn't stop screaming. The technique of forward casualty evacuation that Harold would employ at Moorbrugge had evolved through a process of deadly trial and error that stretched back to the earliest days of the war, a process that had killed dozens of medics before the survivors figured out what worked and what got you killed. The fundamental problem was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve. Wounded men in the open could not be left to die, but the act of reaching them exposed the rescuer to the same fire that had wounded them in the first place, creating a calculus of risk that different medics resolved in different ways depending on their training, their experience, and their psychological makeup. The official doctrine called for medics to wait until fire had been suppressed before attempting evacuation, to use available cover and concealment, to move in short rushes from one protected position to another, to prioritize casualties based on severity and survivability, rather than proximity or personal connection, a set of rules that made perfect sense in the classroom and which dissolved into meaninglessness the moment the bullets started flying and the screaming started. Harold had learned through 14 months of combat that the official doctrine was a useful starting point, but not a reliable guide, that survival depended on intuition and timing, and a kind of tactical awareness that could not be taught, but only developed through experience, the ability to read the rhythm of a firefight and identify the moments when movement was possible and the moments when movement was suicide. He had learned to distinguish between the sounds of different weapons, to know that the distinctive ripping canvas sound of an MG42 meant he had perhaps 2 seconds to move before the gunner adjusted his aim, to understand that mortar fire came in patterns that could be predicted if you paid attention, to recognize the subtle changes in intensity that indicated a lull in the fighting that might last long enough to reach a wounded man and drag him to safety. He had learned to use smoke, both the natural smoke of battle and the smoke grenades that he carried for exactly this purpose, to create visual cover that was imperfect but better than nothing, a grey curtain that degraded the enemy's ability to aim even if it didn't prevent them from firing entirely. He had learned to move low and fast, to present the smallest possible target, to zigzag in patterns that were random enough to defeat prediction, but not so erratic that they slowed him down. A dance with death that he performed dozens of times in every major engagement, and which had so far, through luck or skill or divine intervention, failed to kill him. Most importantly, he had learned to suppress the natural human response to incoming fire, the instinct to freeze or drop or curl into a ball that every soldier experienced and that medics could not afford to indulge, because the moment you stopped moving was the moment you died, and the moment the wounded man you were trying to reach died with you. This suppression was not courage in any conventional sense. It was more like a form of dissociation, a mental trick that allowed him to observe his own body moving through the chaos as if he were watching from a distance, the terror still present, but somehow muted, filtered through a layer of abstraction that made action possible when action should have been impossible. The system worked, when it worked, through a combination of speed, timing, and the cooperation of infantry, who understood that protecting the medic was protecting themselves, that every wounded man Harold saved was a man who might return to the fight, or at least a man who wouldn't be screaming in the open, demoralizing everyone who could hear him. First, the identification of the casualty, usually through sound rather than sight, the distinctive screaming or moaning that indicated a man down and still alive, a sound that Harold had learned to locate with precision, even in the chaos of battle, his ears tuned to the specific frequencies of human suffering. Second, the assessment of risk, a split-second calculation that weighed the distance to the casualty, the intensity of enemy fire, the availability of cover, and the likelihood that the wounded man would survive long enough to make the risk worthwhile. A calculation that Harold performed almost unconsciously now, after 14 months of practice. Third, the communication with nearby infantry, a hand signal or a shouted word that indicated his intention to move, requesting covering fire if possible, warning friendlies not to shoot him as he emerged from cover into the open ground. Fourth, the movement itself, the sprint or crawl or combination of both that closed the distance between him and the casualty, every second stretched into an eternity of waiting for the impact that would end his life, the strange calm that descended when there was no time for fear, only action. Fifth, the treatment performed with hands that had long ago stopped trembling, the rapid assessment of injuries, the application of dressings, the injection of morphine if available and warranted, the stabilization that would give the casualty a chance of surviving long enough to reach the aid post. Sixth, the extraction, the hardest part, the dragging or carrying of a wounded man who might weigh 200 pounds back across the same ground that had nearly killed them both, the dead weight of an unconscious casualty, or the painful cooperation of a conscious one, the agonizing slowness of retreat under fire. Seventh, the delivery to safety, the handoff to stretcher bearers or the placement in a protected position where the casualty could wait for evacuation, and then the immediate return to the cycle, back to step one, scanning for the next casualty, the next scream, the next life that might be saved if he was fast enough and lucky enough and willing to do it all again. This was not the method taught in the training manuals, which emphasized caution and procedure, and the protection of medical personnel as a valuable resource that should not be wasted on futile rescue attempts. This was something Harold had developed on his own, through 14 months of watching men die, because the official procedures were too slow, too cautious, too unwilling to accept the risk that saving lives required. He knew it would kill him eventually, knew that the mathematics of probability would catch up with him sooner or later, but he had made peace with that knowledge somewhere in the mountains of Italy, made peace with the certainty of his own death in a way that freed him to do things that a man who wanted to live could never do. The morning of September 17th began with the artillery preparation that always preceded a major assault, the sound of Canadian and British guns opening fire at 0500, a rolling thunder that shook the ground and lit the horizon with continuous flashes, the massed firepower of a modern army directed at the German positions along the Leopold Canal. Harold listened to the barrage from his shell crater, counting the impacts, estimating the caliber of the guns by the sound of their detonations, a skill he had developed through months of exposure to artillery that had transformed abstract knowledge into intuitive understanding, and he knew from the intensity and duration of the fire that this was going to be a major push, that the battalion was being committed in force, that the day ahead would be long and bloody and would test every skill he had developed, and every limit he had learned to transcend. The German response came within minutes, their own artillery opening up on the Canadian assembly areas, the distinctive whistle of incoming shells that Harold had learned to interpret almost before the sound registered consciously, and he pressed himself into the bottom of his crater as explosions walked across the landscape around him, each impact sending shock waves through the earth that he felt in his bones, the fundamental rhythm of industrial warfare that reduced human beings to spectators. In a contest between machines, a shell landed perhaps 30 meters to his left, the blast close enough to shower him with dirt and debris, close enough to leave his ears ringing and his vision swimming, and when he raised his head after the debris stopped falling, he saw that the crater where 2 riflemen had been sheltering was now a smoking hole filled with things he didn't want to look at. 2 men who had been alive 30 seconds ago, now reduced to components that bore no resemblance to human beings. He did not go to them. There was nothing to go to, nothing that his medical kit could help, and he forced himself to look away, to focus on the living, to suppress the surge of nausea that rose in his throat, because vomiting would waste precious fluids, and there was no time for weakness, not now, not with the assault about to begin. The infantry started moving at 0630, companies rising from their positions and beginning the advance across the open ground toward the canal, a movement that Harold watched from his crater with the professional eye of a man who had seen this scenario play out dozens of times before and who knew exactly what was about to happen. The first casualties came within minutes, the German machine guns opening up with their distinctive ripping sound, men falling in the open, some dropping instantly and lying still, others jerking and thrashing, others stumbling and continuing forward for a few steps before collapsing, the mathematics of the kill zone asserting itself with brutal precision. Harold was moving before conscious thought caught up with him, his body responding to the sound of screaming that rose above the gunfire. The first casualty of the day, a private whose name he would later learn was Thomas Cormier, 19 years old, from Montreal, hit in the left thigh by a machine gun round that had shattered his femur and severed the femoral artery, a wound that would kill him in minutes if the bleeding wasn't stopped, and which required Harold to sprint 40 meters across, open ground while bullets cracked past him, to reach the boy who was lying in the grass screaming for his mother in French. He made it somehow, the bullets missing him by margins he didn't want to think about, and he dropped to his knees beside Cormier and got the tourniquet on the leg and cinched it tight and watched the spurting blood slow to a trickle and then stop, and he jabbed a morphine syrette into the boy's arm and told him in broken French that he was going to be fine, that help was coming, the same lies he told everyone because the truth was too cruel and hope was the only thing he had to offer, besides bandages and drugs. The extraction took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of dragging Cormier's screaming, thrashing body across ground that was being swept by fire. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. And when he finally reached the relative safety of a drainage ditch where stretcher-bearers were waiting, Harold didn't pause to catch his breath, didn't pause to acknowledge the slap on the shoulder that one of the bearers gave him, just turned and looked back toward the killing ground where more men were falling. More screaming was rising. More lives were bleeding out into the Belgian soil while he stood there doing nothing. The second casualty was a sergeant named Douglas McPhee, hit in the abdomen, a wound that Harold knew was probably fatal, but which he treated anyway because you never knew, because sometimes the ones you expected to die survived, and the ones you expected to survive died, and the only way to find out was to try, to pour sulfanilamide into the wound and pack it with dressings and pray that the surgeons could save what you had stabilized. The third casualty was a corporal whose name he never learned, dead before Harold reached him, the stillness of the body apparent from 20 meters away, the specific limpness that distinguished the dead from the wounded, and Harold didn't break stride, just veered toward the next sound of screaming, the next life that might still be saved. By 0800, 90 minutes into the assault, Harold had treated 14 men and extracted 11 of them to the drainage ditch where the stretcher-bearers waited, a rate of activity that was unsustainable, that was burning through his reserves of energy and supplies at a pace that would leave him empty long before the battle ended, but which he could not slow, because the alternative was to leave men to die, and he had decided somewhere in the mountains of Italy that leaving men to die was not something he was capable of doing, whatever the cost. The German defenders had noticed him by now, noticed the figure with the Red Cross helmet who kept appearing in the kill zone, who kept dragging bodies out of their carefully prepared fields of fire, who was single-handedly degrading the effectiveness of their defensive scheme by refusing to let the wounded accumulate in the open, where their screaming would demoralize the attackers and their presence would deter further advances. Oberst Wilke, observing from his command post, noted in his war diary that an enemy medical orderly is operating with complete disregard for personal safety, repeatedly entering the fire zone to extract casualties. His activities are interfering with the suppressive effect of our defensive fire and should be terminated if possible. An order that was easier to give than to execute, because Harold moved unpredictably and quickly, and because the German gunners, whatever their orders, seemed reluctant to deliberately target a man wearing a red cross. This reluctance was not universal, and Harold knew that his immunity, such as it was, could end at any moment, that the conventions of war were fragile things that dissolved under pressure, that a gunner who had watched his friends die was unlikely to care about the legal niceties that theoretically protected medical personnel. But the reluctance was real enough to give him a margin, a fraction of a second's hesitation, in the aim that might make the difference between a hit and a miss, and Harold exploited that margin ruthlessly, moving through spaces where any other soldier would have been cut down, counting on the Red Cross to buy him the time he needed to reach the wounded and drag them to safety. The assault stalled at 0900, the lead companies having advanced perhaps 200 meters from their starting positions at a cost of nearly 40% casualties, the survivors pinned down in whatever cover they could find, unable to advance against the interlocking fire from the German positions, and unwilling to retreat across ground that had already cost so many lives. This was the crisis point, the moment when battles were won or lost, when the momentum either shifted or collapsed entirely, and Harold could see the signs of breaking, men who were no longer firing, no longer trying to advance, just pressing themselves into the earth and waiting for the order to withdraw that they desperately wanted and desperately dreaded. But the wounded kept screaming, and Harold kept moving, and something strange began to happen, something that the official histories would never capture, and that the participants would struggle to explain even decades later. The sight of the medic, the impossibly brave or impossibly insane figure with the Red Cross, who kept running into the fire and coming back alive, began to change the psychology of the battlefield. Men who had given up, who had decided that advancing was suicide, and that the only question was whether they would die where they lay or die trying to retreat, saw Harold sprint past them toward a screaming casualty and felt something shift, something that was not quite shame and not quite inspiration, but something in between, a recognition that if the medic could do what he was doing, then perhaps the situation was not as hopeless as it seemed. A sergeant named William Fraser, who would later receive the military medal for his actions that day, recalled in a post-war interview that watching the doc run through fire that had pinned down 3 platoons made us all feel like cowards, and nobody wanted to be a coward in front of a man like that. So we started shooting back, and then we started moving, and before we knew it, we were assaulting positions that we'd given up on taking. This psychological shift, unmeasurable and unquantifiable, was as important as any tactical innovation in determining the outcome of the battle, a demonstration that the human factor in warfare could not be reduced to equations, that individual acts of courage or endurance could cascade through a unit and transform its collective behavior in ways that no planner could predict. Harold was unaware of any of this, unaware that his actions were having any effect beyond the immediate goal of reaching the wounded and getting them to safety, unaware that the eyes of hundreds of men were following his movements and drawing conclusions from his survival that he would have considered irrational if anyone had explained them to him. He was simply doing the job, the only job he knew how to do, the job that his mother had told him God had given him the hands for, and if that job required him to run into fire that should have killed him, then that was what he would do, because the alternative was to be something other than what he was, and he had stopped being capable of that transformation somewhere between Sicily and Belgium, somewhere in the long, bloody months that had hollowed him out and filled him with something that was not quite courage and not quite insanity, but which served the same function as both. By 10:23 hours, the battle for the approaches to the Leopold Canal has settled into an ugly, grinding stalemate, the kind of prolonged attritional exchange that chews up men and material without producing clear movement on the map, and yet within that apparent deadlock, something unprecedented is unfolding, measured not in meters gained or lost, but in the number of men who are still breathing, solely because Harold Edward Murray refuses to accept what everyone else on the field considers inevitable. The kill zone between the Canadian start line and the German positions is now littered with bodies, Some still, some moving, some dragging themselves toward cover, with the terrible determination of men who have not yet accepted that their legs no longer function, and the air is filled with a constant background noise of pain, a chorus of groans and cries that merges with the mechanical chatter of automatic weapons and the distant thump of artillery into a single, inhuman soundscape that Harold has learned to pass, his mind categorizing each voice almost automatically. This one is shock and will quiet if treated. That one is mortal and will not. That one is panicked and needs eye contact as much as bandages. That one is already fading into the strange, calm tone of a man whose body has given up, even if his brain hasn't yet realized it. By this point, he has already pulled 28 men out of the open, stabilized 34, pronounced 8 beyond help, and moved on, each decision leaving a small scar on whatever remains of his conscience, a series of triage choices that will replay in his mind for decades, each no balancing out a yes in a ledger that has nothing to do with any God he was taught about in the Presbyterian church on the prairie. The forward aid post behind the lines has become a grotesque parody of a hospital, a ditch partially covered with tarpaulins where 2 overworked medical officers and a handful of orderlies work in conditions that would horrify any civilian doctor, cutting away uniforms stiff with dried blood, probing for exit wounds with fingers that shake from fatigue and caffeine, making snap decisions about who gets immediate surgery and who gets tagged expectant, a word that means expected to die, and, which is, for Harold, a red line he cannot cross when he is in the field. At 10:26, a new factor enters the already impossible equation. The battalion's radio nets crackle with reports of a German counterattack forming up on the far side of the canal, infantry and perhaps armor massing to hit the Canadians while they are still disorganized and pinned in front of the positions they have failed to take, a classic application of the elastic defense doctrine that will, if successful, not just stop the assault, but throw it back with catastrophic casualties. This means that artillery, which has been sporadically firing counter-battery missions and harassing fire across the German lines, is about to be redirected, the Canadian guns tasked with disrupting the forming counterattack rather than suppressing the forward positions that are currently shredding the infantry. For Harold, this shift is invisible in strategic terms but brutal in tactical impact. The partial relief that the intermittent enemy suppression had offered him is about to vanish, the German machine guns and mortars regaining their full destructive potential, just as the number of wounded in the open is peaking. The call comes down the line informally, not in the clipped language of orders, but in the raw tone of an exhausted company commander who finds himself faced with an impossible choice. Murray, we're pulling back the lads who can move. We've got to consolidate or we'll be overrun. You can't go out there again. Anyone still out there is gone. Harold hears the words, but his brain refuses to accept their conclusion, refuses to treat living men as already dead, because the map says they are beyond help. He looks out from the shallow depression where he has taken brief cover, looks over the grass and churned earth and scattered equipment, and he sees movement, hands waving weakly, a helmet being raised on a rifle, a leg jerking, signs of life that his training tells him could be preserved if he reaches them in the next 5 to 10 minutes. He also feels, with a clarity that has nothing to do with training, the emptiness inside him where fear used to live, the hollowed-out space that combat has carved in his psyche, leaving behind something that is not bravery, but a kind of functional nihilism. If he dies out there, he dies doing the only thing that still gives his existence meaning. It is at this moment that the recording made 60 years later will catch his voice hesitating, the pause on the tape where an 87-year-old man struggles to describe what went through his mind as the younger version of himself made a decision that no one had the right to ask of him, and that no sane person would endorse, and then the old man says quietly, almost inaudibly, "I couldn't leave them, that's all. I just couldn't leave them." In the moment, Harold does not articulate it, he simply moves. The German fire has intensified as predicted, the machine guns now undistracted by counter-battery fire, the mortar crews given free rein to plaster the assembly areas and the kill zone, and the air is alive with fragments of steel, invisible until they hit something and make it cease to exist or change shape forever. He throws 2 smoke grenades in quick succession, the small canisters hissing as they release dense white clouds that begin to drift and billow across the ground, imperfect concealment that nevertheless degrades the enemy's ability to aim with precision and then he is up and running into the smoke, counting the seconds in his head. Not to time anything in particular, but to anchor himself, to impose rhythm on chaos. 1, 2, 3, drop, listen, move. The first man he reaches is lying on his back, blood soaking his battle dress from a wound in the chest that bubbles with each shallow breath, the telltale froth of a punctured lung, and Harold knows he has maybe 10 minutes to get this man to the aid post if he is going to live, less if he doesn't seal the wound now. He slaps a field dressing over the entry wound, probes quickly for an exit and finds none, curses under his breath and pulls a second dressing from the kit, improvising an occlusive seal with tape and the plastic wrapper, creating a flutter valve that will, if he's lucky, prevent the man from drowning in his own blood. There's no time for morphine, breathing is already hard enough, and depressing the respiratory drive could kill him faster. "You are going to be all right," Harold lies because the truth is useless here, and he hooks his hands under the man's webbing and begins to drag, feet digging into the mud, every muscle in his back and shoulders lighting up with pain that he will only fully register days later when the adrenaline finally leaves his system. The journey back to cover is a nightmare of near misses and impacts, bullets snapping overhead, mortar fragments whining like angry hornets, the weight behind him alternating between resistance and limp acquiescence as the wounded man drifts in and out of consciousness, occasionally crying out when the movement jars the wound, each cry a reminder that if Harold slows down, he will die within earshot of safety. It takes 2 minutes that feel like 20, but they make it, tumbling into the drainage ditch where other hands reach out to grab the casualty and pull him in, and Harold doesn't stop, doesn't pause to catch his breath or savor the small victory, just spins and looks back toward the kill zone where more shapes are still moving, more hands still waving. He makes the run again, and again, and again. By noon, according to later estimates pieced together from eyewitness accounts and Harold's own notebook, he has gone out into the open 22 times and brought back 21 men, one casualty dying in his arms halfway back, the light going out of his eyes so suddenly that Harold almost drops him from surprise, the transformation from person to object so abrupt that it feels like a physical blow. He does not write that man's name in the notebook right away. He will fill it in later from unit records when the chaos is over, because in the moment he cannot bear to commit to paper another failure, even one that any rational observer would say was inevitable and not his fault. The German defenders are watching this too, and the psychological effect on them is the mirror image of what it is on the Canadians. A machine gun team in a sandbagged position, commanded by Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Bremer, has a clear field of fire on the kill zone and has been methodically engaging targets since the assault began, firing disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition, working the beaten zone with the efficiency and detachment of men who have long since accepted that they are instruments in a larger machine. Bremer will later write in a letter to his wife, found after the war in an archive, that there was one man, a medic, who ran out again and again. We could have killed him many times, but after a while I could not order it. My gunner hesitated whenever he saw the Red Cross. Perhaps we were fools, perhaps the war made us mad, but I had a son his age. This hesitation, multiplied across several positions, creates tiny gaps in the web of fire, little pockets of reduced lethality that Harold, without knowing it, is exploiting with every run, his survival owed as much to the remnants of humanity in his enemies as to his own skill and luck. By 1300 hours, the Canadian infantry, heartened by the knowledge that they will not be left to die if they are hit, has resumed a slow, painful advance, fire and movement inching them closer to the German strongpoints, grenades and bayonets and Payat rounds, doing the brutal, intimate work of clearing bunkers and trenches that artillery could not destroy. The battalion commander notes in his log that morale remains remarkably high in forward companies, despite heavy casualties, largely due to extraordinary performance of medical personnel, ensuring rapid evacuation of wounded. A sterile sentence that does not begin to convey the reality of what Harold's actions mean to the men whose blood is soaking into the Belgian soil. Harold is not aware of morale. He is aware of numbers. At some point in the afternoon, in a brief lull between waves of casualties, he ducks behind the shattered remains of a hedgerow and pulls out his notebook, the small sweat-stained volume that he has been carrying since Sicily, and he flips to a fresh page and starts a new column. 75, the number that will become legend in his family decades later, is not a goal he sets for himself. It is the number that emerges when he looks back at the tally at the end of the day. In the moment, He is chasing something else, something harder to define. He is chasing the point at which he will finally fail, the point at which his body will give out or the bullets will find him, the point at which the universe will tell him, with the cold finality of physics, that he has done enough, that he can stop. That point never comes. Instead, what comes is a kind of detachment that borders on the surreal, a sense that he is watching himself move through the battle from a distance, his body a tool executing tasks that his conscious mind is only loosely attached to, as if he has become his own ghost, haunting the killing ground in real time. He will describe this on the tape found in 2005 as like being underwater, hearing everything muffled, seeing everything slowed down, like I was already dead and just hadn't fallen over yet. And the psychologist who later listens to the recording will underline that sentence 3 times and write in the margin, "Classic dissociation." The 70th man he rescues is a German. It happens almost by accident. It is 14:10 hours, and the Canadian assault has finally reached the first line of German trenches, close quarters fighting erupting as men who have been shooting at each other from hundreds of meters away now find themselves face to face in narrow ditches filled with mud and fear and the smell of unwashed bodies. Harold is moving up with the second wave, his kit replenished once again from the forward aid post, when he hears a sound he has never heard from a German throat before, a word that cuts through the babel of English and French and shouted commands, "Sanitator! Medic!" He freezes for a second, his brain jolted by the familiarity of the plea, and he looks down into the trench and sees a German soldier clutching at a stump where his left hand used to be, blood pumping steadily from the severed wrist, his face grey with shock, his eyes locked on Harold's red cross like a drowning man locking onto a lifebuoy. For a moment, time seems to hold its breath. The Canadian infantry around the trench are still firing, still shouting, still clearing the position, and no one has noticed the German calling to their medic. Harold has a choice to make in that instant, a choice that has nothing to do with orders or doctrine, and everything to do with the vow he made as a 12-year-old boy in Saskatoon, with a dead sparrow in his hands. He jumps into the trench. The German flinches, expecting a bullet or a bayonet, but instead Harold is on one knee beside him, the tourniquet already in his hands, wrapping it around the upper arm, pulling it tight until the blood flow slows and stops. The German is shaking, his teeth chattering despite the September warmth, and Harold hears himself speaking in halting schoolboy German he didn't know he still remembered, telling the man, "Du lebst, du bist in Ordnung. You live, you are all right," lies that are the same in every language. A Canadian private, adrenaline still high from the close quarters fight, drops into the trench and raises his rifle, sees the German, sees Harold, and for a second the barrel wavers between them. "He's hit," Harold snaps, sharper than he's spoken all day. "He's a casualty. You shoot him and you shoot me." The private's jaw clenches, the conflict visible in his eyes, the desire for revenge wrestling with the remnants of training and decency, and then he lowers the rifle and climbs out of the trench, leaving Harold and the German alone for a brief, strange moment in the middle of the battle. Harold finishes the dressing, scribbles German on a tag along with the time and the nature of the wound, and then he waves to a pair of stretcher-bearers moving along the trench line, gesturing them over with a tired flick of his wrist. They look at the German, look at Harold, and one of them starts to protest, but Harold cuts him off with a look that brooks no argument. "He bleeds the same as we do," he says, and the bearers, who have watched him all day and owe him more than they can ever repay, nod and lift the German onto the stretcher, carrying him back toward the aid post, where the medical officers will treat him, according to the Geneva Convention and the dictates of their own battered consciences. This act, more than any other that day, will haunt Harold. Not because he regrets it, he doesn't, but because it forces him to confront the reality that he has spent months trying to suppress, that there is no moral difference between the men he is saving and the men his country has sent him to fight, that the line between friend and enemy is an abstraction that dissolves the moment you are close enough to see the color of a man's eyes as he begs you not to let him die. By 1600 hours, the battle is effectively decided. The German positions have been breached at multiple points. Their defensive fire has slackened as ammunition runs low and casualties mount, and the threat of a major counterattack has diminished as Canadian artillery systematically pounds the assembly areas on the far side of the canal into churned earth and shattered bodies. The cost has been appalling. Company rosters are shredded, platoons reduced to half strength or less, the ground around the canal a patchwork of craters and corpses. But the line has held, the attack has not been thrown back, and the Canadians are still in possession of the approaches. a fact that will be recorded in battalion war diaries in unemotional language that gives no clue to what it felt like to be there. Harold at this point is operating on something beyond exhaustion, his body a collection of pains and protests that his brain has stopped listening to. His uniform is stiff with dried blood and mud, the red cross on his helmet nearly obscured by grime and soot, his hands swollen and blistered from hours of dragging and lifting and bandaging. When he finally collapses beside the aid post at 16:23 hours, his legs simply buckling under him without warning, it is not a dramatic faint or a cinematic swoon, just a quiet surrender to gravity, his body deciding without consulting him that it has reached the absolute limit of what it can do. Someone gives him water. Someone pries the medical kit off his shoulders. Someone drapes a blanket over him even though he is not cold, his internal thermostat still skewed by shock and exertion. He stares up at the sky, which is now a filthy white grey smeared with smoke, and he realizes, with a kind of detached surprise, that he has survived the day. 75. That is the number in his notebook when he counts later, sitting in a barn that has been turned into a makeshift rest area, his hands still shaking as he traces the columns of names. 75 wounded men reached, treated and evacuated under fire in the space of approximately 10 hours, an average of 1 every 8 minutes, though the distribution was far from even, the day a series of frantic clusters and brief lulls, rather than a steady drip. He does not show the notebook to anyone. He does not mention the number to the battalion medical officer, or the chaplain or the company commander, who will later write him up for a mention in dispatches that never materializes into any formal decoration because the paperwork is lost, or the bureaucrats decide that medics are doing their job and that heroism is expected, not exceptional. He closes the notebook, puts it back in his breast pocket next to Eleanor's photograph and the German medic's photo that he still carries, and he goes to sleep sitting upright, his back against the rough wood of the barn wall, his head tilted at an angle that will leave his neck aching for days. But for once he does not dream, his mind too depleted to generate images, his subconscious taking one blessed night off from replaying the worst moments of his life. It will not be so merciful in the years to come.